Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm going to be walking you through the steps on how to make my latest mug rug called Pretty Petals. Let's get started. To make the top of this mug rug, you're going to need 8 strips of fabric that measure 12 inches long and 1.5 inches wide. Then arrange them all nice and pretty. Then you're going to go ahead and sew each one of your strips together. So put pretty sides facing each other and sew your strips just like this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to go nice and slow on this first set of 2 pieces so that you can see that I really take my time and line up those raw edges as I go along, sewing from one end to the next. Then we'll fast forward and do the other sets of 2 with pretty sides together, trying to stay as straight as possible. You might hear some birds in the background today. You might hear a rooster. My neighbor has gotten a rooster in the last couple of weeks, and he's been quite active today. So once you have your strips sewn together, 2 pieces, we're going to open them up, and before I even press them, I'm just going to keep on sewing. So let's open up the first 2 pieces. We could just finger press them if you want. We're going to join in these sections of 2 together. Just like this, we'll flip the pretty side over. And again, we're just joining with a 1/4 inch seam allowance from one end to the next. I tend to struggle sometimes with these skinnier little strips of fabric when piecing them, so I really take my time. I sew a little bit, stop, line up the next section and sew a little bit. And I go nice and slow just to help keep everything straight and to help it keep from getting wonky. I have an easier time with strips that are at least 2.5 inches wide. So nice and slow from one end to the other. We'll fast forward this next section. So at this point you have 2 groups of 4. And then we're going to just do the same thing and join these 2 sections of 4 together, and we'll end up with 8 strips all sewn together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you want to press each seam before you move on, you can totally do that. I just find it easier to press all the seams once I'm done. Here at the iron, we're going to go nice and slow as I press these seams. To get started, I like to press my seams all in one direction. And I usually start on the back side. And I just work my iron over those seams, pressing them all to one side. Sometimes I slightly pull on the fabric to help straighten everything out. These smaller little strips have a tendency to want to go a little crooked and a little wonky. And once I've pressed my seams from the back side, I'll flip it over to the pretty side. Pull everything nice and straight and flatten it out with my fingers, and then press again. When you sew a bunch of seams close together, they tend to want to do this little accordion type of thing. And so I just find it easier to sort of manipulate those strips, pulling them out, and just taking my time when pressing pieces like this. To make the petals of the flower, you're going to need 12 pieces of fabric that measure 3 inches wide and 4.5 inches tall. You're going to flip the pretty sides together, just like this. And then you're going to take the little petal template and you're going to trace that on the back side of the top fabric. You might find it helpful to throw a little pin in there to keep it in place. And then we're going to sew it. To sew these pieces, you might want to lower your stitch length to a shorter stitch length than what you usually piece your quilt pieces with. Remember to do a back stitch at the beginning and the end to lock these ends in place. And you're going to stitch right on the line that you've traced of the petal piece. That shorter stitch length is going to really come in handy when you're turning this right side out. It's going to help you give a more accurate curve at the tip of your petal. The stitch length, just in case you're wondering, that I'm using is a 1.8 on my Juki HZL F600. You might want to experiment with your stitch length on whatever machine you're using. Don't forget, when you get to the edge, do a little back stitch to lock it in place. You're going to do this for 6 different sets of petals. When you're done stitching all of your petals, we're going to take them and trim away all the extra fabric from around the shape of each petal. And I like to leave about 1/8 seam allowance all the way around. Very, very tiny seam allowance. Then we can turn this right side out. Take our finger and shove out the tip of the petal, and you might even want to use a pokey tool. And then we can press these petals nice and flat. Next, we're going to be making the center of the flower. To do that, I'm going to be using some Heat and Bond Light, and I traced my template. And we're going to fuse that to the back side of the fabric that I want to use for the center of the flower. And now we're going to cut that shape out directly on the line. So let's bring in the top of our mug rug. We're going to line up the center of the flower right to the bottom right corner. And I'm only fusing just a little bit near that corner so that I can tuck the petals up under the raw edge of that circle or quarter circle, the center of the flower. You can arrange the petals until they're exactly where you want them, and then finish fusing your fusible all the way down. You might also find it helpful to pin a couple of these petals down in place until everything is stitched. So at this point, I like to go ahead and layer the layers of my mug rug. So I have the backing with the pretty side facing down, the batting of my mug rug, and then the top of my mug rug with the pretty side facing up. I'm going to glue baste my layers, and I'm using a clear washable school glue stick to do that. And I'll dry that glue with a good hot iron before moving on. While I'm right here, I'm going to go ahead and turn over my binding as well. So using the same glue stick, I'm just going to work my way around the binding. The measurements for this pattern have provided an extra inch all the way around this mug rug to do a self-binding. Or you could just trim that away and do a traditional binding if you wanted to. Or you could trim the extra away and layer it so that you are sewing all the pieces and then flipping your project right side out. To do that, you could put your batting down first, and then your backing fabric with the pretty side facing up, and then your mug rug top with the pretty side facing down. Sew around all the edges and then flip it right side out. I'm a huge fan of these self-bindings. I think they go by pretty quick and make these mug rug projects a lot faster. Have you heard the rooster yet? So here is my mug rug. We're ready to go stitch this down. To start, I'm going to go ahead and just stitch this binding down. So I have some blue thread that matches the binding color. And I'm just doing a straight stitch just inside that binding all the way around. Now, one thing is for sure is I have a lot of decorative stitches in my sewing machine that I hardly ever use. So I thought I would get creative today and use a decorative stitch to stitch down the raw edge of the center of my flower, and that's going to lock my petals in place too. So on my machine, I'll put it up here on the screen. I'm using stitch number 30 with a stitch length of a 7.0 and a stitch width of 10.4, and I've lowered my tension to a -3, and that's giving me a very pretty, nice, and even decorative stitch. We're sewing through lots of layers of fabric here. We have the petals, we have the center fabric with the heat and bond, we have the tops of our mug rugs and the seams and those seams and the strips, the batting and the backing fabric, y'all. So take your time and adjust your stitch according. Now we can take the pins out of the flowers, and I'm going to pin those up out of the way. Just getting those petals out of the way because I want to do a straight stitch on each of the strips that we pieced together in the very beginning, just to quilt the rest of this mug rug, and that's nice and simple and goes by pretty quick. Of course, you could do any kind of quilting on this background. I think a meandering would look awesome. The stitch in the ditch is really quick. I could not figure out a top thread color to use that really matched all of these different shades of green. I tried a few different green threads, and some of them just clashed with some of my greens. So I just picked a neutral, like a medium tan color, and that kind of goes with the mug rug and doesn't clash with any of the greens. You ever have issues trying to pick a top thread color that matches everything you're quilting? Those neutrals really come in handy at times like that. And that's it, y'all. Once you finish quilting your mug rug, you are done. I'm going to unpin these petals and push them back down in place, and then trim up all of my jump stitches. This mug rug is so fun to make. It really is. And when I was making it, I thought about the possibilities of customizing this mug rug. I think this mug rug lends a lot of possibilities to doing monograms or sayings, all kinds of stuff in that center of the flower. Isn't she so cute? I love it so much. Yeah, right here. Wouldn't that be cute to do a little monogram or a name right there? Well, thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and I hope that this project inspires you to make something really spring-like and kind of girly this week. Y'all have a fantastic week. I'll see y'all soon. Bye, everybody.